The kitchen stinks of burning fat and desperation. It's 73 BC in Capua, and you're cornered. You're a gladiator, a human weapon forged in blood and sand. But right now, you're unarmed in a cooking room, while armored guards block the only exit. The secret escape plan has leaked. Someone talked. You have maybe 10 seconds before a Roman sword opens your throat. Your hand reaches into the cooking fire. The pain is immediate and meaningless. You grab a scorching iron spit, the kind used for roasting pigs. Beside you, another man seizes a meat cleaver. The guard charging through the doorway doesn't expect kitchen staff to fight back. The spit punches through the gap in his armor just below the rib cage. He goes down screaming. This is how revolutions actually begin. Not with stirring speeches or noble manifestos. With cooking utensils, panic, and improvised murder in a hallway that smells like onions and blood. Within the hour, these kitchen knives will carve a path out of slavery. Within a year, they'll force Rome to its knees. Within 2 years, they'll line the roads with 6,000 crucified men whose only crime was believing they deserved to be free. This is the real story of Spartacus, the one Hollywood sanitized, the one that reveals what happens when the impossible briefly becomes real before reality crushes it into dust. How does a brawl with meat cleavers spiral into a war that nearly destroyed the Roman Republic? How does a gladiator school breakout transform into an existential threat to the greatest military power on earth? And why, after defeating Rome's best generals and standing at the gateway to freedom, did Spartacus turn around and march his army back into the slaughterhouse? Before we descend into this blood-soaked tragedy, if you're hungry for the brutal truths hiding behind sanitized history, smash that like button and subscribe to Maproom Battles. Drop a comment telling me which historical figure you think has been most distorted by legend. I'll be reading every response. Now let's enter the ludus and discover how 70 desperate men became Rome's worst nightmare. The conspiracy at Lentulus Batiatus's gladiatorial school was never meant to be a war. It was supposed to be a prison break. 200 men slipping away into the Italian night, disappearing into the countryside before dawn. But in a place where starvation makes men sell each other for an extra piece of bread, silence is impossible. A traitor whispered. Maybe he was promised freedom. Maybe just better food. The details don't matter. What matters is that the masters knew. The crackdown was instantaneous and brutal. Guards flooded the barracks. They locked the armory where the gladiatorial weapons were stored. They sealed the exits. The conspirators faced a simple choice: wait in their cells for execution, or fight with whatever they could touch. 70 men chose violence. They didn't charge the locked armory. They bypassed it entirely. Surging toward the kitchen, the one room in the ludus that contained tools sharp enough to kill. Roasting spits became improvised spears. Meat cleavers became axes. Knives used for peeling vegetables were suddenly opening human throats. The violence was frantic, close quarters, desperate. The sound of metal on bone echoed through the stone corridors. The gladiators had one advantage. They were trained killers facing regular prison guards who'd grown soft from years of beating unarmed slaves. The guards had armor and short swords. The gladiators had rage and nothing left to lose. It wasn't even close. They overwhelmed the sentries through sheer ferocity, grabbing shields and weapons from the fallen, and burst out of the ludus into the streets of Capua. Chaos gripped the city. Citizens saw blood-soaked giants running past their shops, not stopping to loot, just desperate to escape before the alarm brought legions. The fugitives sprinted for the city gates, and fortune finally smiled. They collided with a wagon train transporting legitimate gladiatorial weapons to another city's games. They seized the crates, suddenly armed with tridents, nets, and short swords. They fought off the local militia shopkeepers and merchants playing soldier and disappeared into the Italian countryside. But here, Spartacus made his first strategic decision that revealed he wasn't just another escaped slave. As soon as they defeated their first actual Roman soldiers, he ordered the men to abandon the gladiator weapons entirely. Think about that. These were men who'd spent years mastering the trident, perfecting the net, becoming artists with the arena's specialized killing tools. Spartacus told them to throw it all away. He wanted the gladius and the scutum, the sword and shield of the legion. He wasn't building a troop of entertainers. He was building an army that could fight Rome using Rome's own tactics. They retreated to Mount Vesuvius. The volcano was dormant, a massive, jagged fortress of rock and wild vines offering perfect defensive positions. Rome, still arrogant, dismissed the threat. The Senate called it a tumultus, a minor disturbance, barely worth mentioning. They didn't send a consul or a praetor with real authority. They sent Claudius Glaber with 3,000 hastily gathered militia, basically armed civilians with delusions of military competence. Glaber arrived at Vesuvius and saw the slaves trapped on the summit. He studied the sheer cliffs surrounding the volcano and smiled. He controlled the only path, up or down. Why risk Roman lives in direct assault? He'd simply wait. Hunger would force the slaves to surrender within days. He ordered his men to set up camp at the base of the trail, blocking the exit completely. On the crater rim, the situation deteriorated fast. The slaves had no food stores, no water source. The path down was blocked by 3,000 armed men. Any conventional military thinker would see this as checkmate. Spartacus surveyed the perimeter and saw something different. The drop from the crater rim was a vertical wall of rock that Glaber had left completely unguarded because no sane person would attempt descent. But Spartacus wasn't sane in the conventional sense. He pointed to the wild vines choking the crater's edge, thick, ancient growth that had been strangling trees for decades. The men got to work, cutting and braiding vines into long, sturdy rope ladders. As night fell and wind picked up, masking sound, they began their descent. One by one, they slipped over the edge, dangling thousands of feet above jagged rocks, descending into pitch blackness. Hands bled. Muscles screamed. Men fell to their deaths in silence, swallowed by the dark. But most made it. They reached the bottom, shadow by shadow, completely undetected. Glaber slept soundly in his command tent. His sentries watched the main path, oblivious to the threat circling behind them through the darkness. The sun hadn't yet risen when the screaming started. What would you do if you woke up to a sword at your throat, held by a man you'd assumed was safely trapped? How would your brain process the impossible made real? Keep that question in mind. The slaves attacked from the rear, like wolves descending on sleeping sheep. Glaber's militia woke to swords in their faces, to kitchen knife survivors who transformed into coordinated killers. The camp disintegrated in minutes. Men stumbled from their tents half-dressed, reaching for weapons that weren't there, dying before they understood what was happening. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The morning sun rose over a field of Roman corpses. Spartacus stood among the wreckage wearing a Roman officer's cloak, holding a Roman officer's sword. The kitchen knives were gone. The revolt had survived its birth. But this victory created a new, unexpected problem. Success attracts attention, and attention brings recruits. After Vesuvius, the trickle of runaways became a flood. They came from vineyards, mines, and latifundia estates across southern Italy. Gauls, Germans, Thracians, Syrians, a babel of languages and ancient grudges, all unified by one thing. They'd rather die fighting than live in chains. By winter's onset, Spartacus commanded not 70 gladiators, but a swelling mass approaching 70,000 desperate souls. This wasn't a band of fugitives anymore. It was a migration, a moving city of the dispossessed. But migrations can't fight professional armies. Most of these people were shepherds and field hands who knew how to shear sheep, not maintain shield formations against Roman charges. Spartacus realized that if they met real legions in open battle, they'd be slaughtered like the livestock they'd once tended. The winter of 73 to 72 BC became a season of impossible industry. The camp transformed into a massive open-air weapons factory, operating at a scale that would make modern manufacturing executives take notes. Spartacus enforced discipline harder than any Roman master ever had. He forbade hoarding gold and silver. Precious metals were useless against iron swords. He wanted iron, steel, anything that could be forged into weapons. They raided local prisons, not to liberate the criminals, but to melt down their iron fetters for sword blades. They cut down entire forests to harden into spear shafts. They stripped hides from thousands of cattle to make shields. Spartacus drilled them relentlessly, teaching shepherds to fight in formation, to move as one lethal organism. He took the raw chaos of a refugee mob and hammered it into the structure of a Roman legion. He knew the enemy's playbook because he'd studied it as a warrior. Now he was building a mirror image of the Roman army, forged from the very people Rome had tried to crush into dust. But as the army grew, so did internal tension. The Third Servile War wasn't led by one visionary. It was commanded by a committee of captains, and the fundamental rift between them was widening into a chasm. On one side stood Spartacus, pragmatic, strategic, clear-eyed about mathematics. He looked at maps and saw reality. Rome had functionally infinite manpower. They couldn't win a war of attrition against an empire that controlled the Mediterranean. His plan was brutally simple. March north across the Alps, disperse the men back to their homelands in Gaul and Thrace. Let them disappear into familiar territories. He offered freedom through escape. On the other side stood Crixus, a Gallic warrior of immense physical power and different charisma. He looked at the soft, wealthy cities of southern Italy and saw opportunity. Why walk over freezing Alps to return to subsistence farming in cold barbarian villages? Why run when they were winning every battle? Crixus wanted to stay in Italy, sack the rich coastal towns, make Rome bleed for centuries of oppression. He offered freedom through conquest and revenge. The army became a two-headed beast, one head looking toward mountains and safety, the other toward plunder and vengeance. For now, their raid successes kept this tension from exploding, but the fracture was there, hairline deep, waiting for pressure to shatter everything. Rome, stung by Glaber's humiliation, tried again. They sent Praetor Publius Varinius with a more organized force of trained soldiers rather than militia. He expected to face a disorganized rabble. He found ghosts. Spartacus fought a guerrilla war that Varinius couldn't comprehend. The slave army struck and vanished like smoke. They ambushed foraging parties, cut supply lines, appeared where impossible, and disappeared before reinforcements arrived. In one particularly humiliating encounter, Spartacus nearly captured Varinius himself while the Roman commander was bathing. The praetor barely escaped naked, leaving behind his horse, his ceremonial lictors, and the fasces, that bundle of rods and axe, symbolizing Roman legal authority. Imagine the Senate's reaction when news arrived. Spartacus, a runaway slave, was now carrying the fasces through Italy. It was deliberate mockery, a middle finger to Roman power. He was telling them, "I am the law now." Varinius tried to trap them in a valley using a classic blockade strategy. He watched their campfires burning brightly all night, heard their sentries blowing trumpets at regular intervals, and waited for dawn to launch the final assault. Morning came. Varinius ordered the charge. His troops stormed the slave camp expecting slaughter. They found nothing but corpses. The sentries were dead men, lashed to wooden stakes, dressed in armor to look like living guards from a distance. The trumpeters had been a single man left behind to maintain the illusion. While Varinius stared at flickering fires, the entire slave army, tens of thousands of people, had slipped away in darkness through the unguarded flank. Varinius was disgraced, recalled to Rome in shame. The slaves spent winter fattening themselves on the spoils of Metapontum and Thurii, living like kings in territories that had enslaved them. But spring 72 BC brought a changed wind. The Senate stopped treating this as a police action. They declared a state of emergency, mobilizing both consuls, the two highest elected officials in the Republic, Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, marched south with 4 full legions, 20,000 professional killers trained from childhood to conquer the world. Spartacus knew the raiding season was over. He ordered the army to pack up. They were marching north toward the Alps, toward home, toward survival. But Crixus didn't move. The Gaul stood his ground with 30,000 men loyal to him, mostly Gauls and Germans, who shared his thirst for Roman blood and Italian gold. They refused to leave the rich lands. The split was final and catastrophic. Spartacus marched north with the main body. Crixus broke away, taking his 30,000 followers to the slopes of Mount Garganus. It was a fatal mistake. These Romans weren't Glaber or Verinius. They were a hammer looking for an anvil. And Crixus had just placed himself perfectly. How many times have you seen success breed overconfidence, watched victory poison judgment? Crixus was about to learn that Rome forgives nothing. Crixus took his 30,000 followers to Mount Garganus, overlooking the Adriatic Sea. Drunk on confidence from 2 years of unbroken victories, he believed Romans were soft, corrupt, ripe for harvesting. He'd forgotten one fundamental rule: never underestimate an enemy that conquered the known world through methodical brutality. Consul Gellius Publicola wasn't a frightened militia commander. He was a professional butcher who'd spent decades perfecting the art of organized violence. He tracked Crixus down with terrifying speed, and he didn't offer parley or wait for proper battle formations. Publicola struck at dawn when men were still shaking off sleep, when discipline was loosest. The legions crashed into the rebel camp like an iron tsunami. The Gauls and Germans fought with berserker ferocity. But individual bravery means nothing against coordinated system. The Roman shield wall ground forward step by bloody step, an industrial meat grinder processing human beings into corpses. It was slaughter, not battle. Crixus fought in the center of the melee. Historical accounts say he killed 12 legionaries with his bare hands before finally falling, pierced by multiple spears. The wolf of the rebellion died roaring. Of his 30,000 followers, 2/3 were butchered on the spot. The survivors scattered into woods, hunted like animals for sport. Publicola sent a message to his colleague Lentulus Clodianus. One head is severed, now for the other. The trap was set for Spartacus, using classic Roman pincer tactics, a strategy that had crushed Carthage, broken Greek phalanxes, and would later destroy barbarian kingdoms. Lentulus marched his legions north, blocking the road to the Alps and cutting off escape routes. Publicola, fresh from Garganus victory, chased from the south. They had Spartacus in a box, hammer and anvil, with the Thracian gladiator as the metal between. When news of Crixus's death reached Spartacus, he didn't panic or grieve publicly. He calculated. He understood that if the two consular armies linked up, the war ended in massacre. His only chance was speed, moving faster than legions could coordinate. He did the unthinkable. Instead of defensive preparations or flanking maneuvers, Spartacus accelerated straight toward Lentulus in the north. He chose to attack the blocking force head-on before the pursuing force could arrive. It violated every conventional military principle. Never attack uphill, never attack fortified positions, never attack when outnumbered. Spartacus hit Lentulus's legions like a freight train collision. He unleashed the heavy infantry he'd drilled through that brutal winter, men who'd transformed from shepherds into soldiers. They smashed through the Roman center with coordinated violence, that shocked veterans who'd expected disorganized rabble. Lentulus's legions broke. His baggage train was captured. The anvil shattered into fragments. But Spartacus didn't stop to celebrate or loot. He knew Publicola was still coming from behind, expecting to find Spartacus pinned against Lentulus. Spartacus spun his entire army around and marched back the way he'd come, straight into the face of the second consul. Publicola was caught completely off guard. He expected to find Spartacus trapped against Lentulus's forces. Instead, he found Lentulus's army gone and Spartacus charging at him with the momentum of absolute victory. The psychological shock was devastating. The victors of Mount Garganus routed. Publicola fled for his life. In a span of days, one former slave had dismantled the armies of both consuls of Rome, the highest military commanders in the Republic. The Senate was stunned into silence. The path to the Alps now stood wide open. Nothing prevented the slaves from walking home to freedom. But Spartacus stopped. Something had changed in him. Maybe it was the intoxicating taste of total victory. Maybe it was burning rage over Crixus's death. Or maybe, looking at thousands of captured Romans, he realized that simply leaving wasn't enough. He wanted to send a message that would scar itself into the Roman psyche forever. He ordered the march to halt. He gathered his army in a massive assembly. He brought out 300 Roman prisoners, centurions, tribunes, proud citizens of the Republic who'd never imagined they'd be anything other than masters. He didn't execute them quickly. That would be too merciful, too forgettable. Spartacus looked at the captured Roman armor piled high. He looked at the 300 trembling prisoners. Then he looked at his own men, the former gladiators who'd been forced to murder their brothers for the amusement of cheering Roman crowds. He was going to host funeral games to honor Crixus's ghost. But this time, the roles would be reversed. The masters would fight to the death. The slaves would be the spectators. The world would be turned upside down. What kind of man forces his enemies to experience exactly what they inflicted? Was this justice or just revenge? Hold that question as we enter the arena. Imagine you're a Roman soldier. A week ago, you marched under eagle standards, convinced of your civilizational superiority, certain that history moved in your favor. Now you're naked in mud, clutching a gladius that feels impossibly heavy, standing in a crude ring of wooden stakes driven into dirt. Surrounding you are thousands of people you considered farm equipment last month. Slaves, shepherds, subhumans. They're screaming, jeering, betting on how long you'll last. Across the ring stands your opponent, not some barbarian stranger, but Gaius, the man you shared bread with for 3 years, who saved your life at that skirmish in Spain. He looks at you with tears and terror. Neither of you wants this. But a large Thracian steps forward, raises his hand for silence, and nods. You have no choice. Refusal means being burned alive. So you raise your sword and attack your friend. This was the reality of Spartacus's funeral games. By forcing 300 Roman prisoners to fight as gladiators, Spartacus wasn't just executing enemies. He was dismantling the Roman soul, holding up a mirror to the Republic saying, "Look at what you made us do. Now feel it yourselves." The psychological impact on Rome was catastrophic. When news reached the capital, the elite were paralyzed. Their entire moral hierarchy, Romans as masters, everyone else as beasts, had been inverted and shattered. But Spartacus didn't linger on spectacle. He burned remaining equipment, slaughtered pack animals to lighten the column, and drove his army north with renewed urgency. He knew the opportunity window was closing. They reached Cisalpine Gaul, modern northern Italy, where only one obstacle remained: Governor Gaius Cassius Longinus, with 10,000 men waiting near Mutina. Longinus thought he could stop the avalanche. He was catastrophically wrong. Spartacus hit him with storm momentum. The battle was barely a contest. The slave army, battle-hardened and flushed with consular victories, swept Longinus aside like he was nothing. And then occurred the moment that has baffled historians for 2,000 years. Spartacus stood at the foot of the Alps. The white peaks glistened in summer sun. Beyond them lay the free lands of Gaul, Germania, Thrace. There were no Roman legions on the other side. The road was open. The war was effectively won. All they had to do was climb. They didn't. Spartacus gave the order to turn around. Why? This decision remains the greatest mystery of the Third Servile War. Did the army refuse to leave? Possible, many were now rich with plunder, seeing Italy as a treasure chest rather than a prison. Why return to hard-scrabble farming in cold villages when you could be kings in the south? Or was it Spartacus himself? Did victory poison his judgment? Did he begin believing his own legend, that he could actually march on Rome and topple the Republic? We'll never know the conversations in that command tent. We only know the consequence. The army turned its back on freedom and marched south, back into the wolf's mouth. In Rome, panic turned into hollow silence. The consuls had failed. Governors had failed. There were no more armies. The path to the capital was defenseless. The Senate convened in the Temple of Concord, the mood funereal. They asked for a commander to fight the gladiators. Usually, ambitious men would fight for such command glory as Rome's currency. This time, nobody stood. To fight Spartacus risked humiliation. Win, and you defeated a slave, no glory there. Lose, and you're history's laughingstock. The Senate's respected names studied their feet. The silence stretched, heavy and shameful. Then from the back, a man stood. He wasn't a great general. He was a businessman, the largest landlord in Rome, owner of silver mines, fire brigades, tenement blocks, dangerously ambitious and obscenely wealthy. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. He looked around the frightened Senate and spoke calmly. He didn't ask for legions. He offered to buy them, to fund an army from his own fortune. He was privatizing the war, treating it as an investment problem. The Senate, desperate and humiliated, agreed. They had no idea they'd just unleashed something colder and more calculating than Spartacus ever was. Crassus left the Senate house and went straight to recruiters. He was about to teach both slaves and Romans the true meaning of discipline. Marcus Licinius Crassus didn't fight for honor. He fought for return on investment. To him, the Roman Republic wasn't just a nation. It was a portfolio whose value was plummeting because of a Thracian slave. He intended to correct the market. He took command of 6 new legions funded, equipped, and effectively owned by him. But he also inherited remnants of the consular armies Spartacus had humiliated. These men were broken, accustomed to running, having looked into the slave army's eyes and blinked. Crassus knew that before defeating Spartacus, he had to defeat his own soldiers' cowardice. He tested them immediately, sending Lieutenant Mummius with 2 legions to shadow Spartacus with explicit orders. Do not engage, just watch. But Mummius was arrogant, seeing an opportunity for personal glory. He ignored orders and attacked near Picenum. The result was predictable. The slaves, fighting with undefeated veteran confidence, shattered Roman lines. Mummius fled, his soldiers throwing down shields and running. They returned to Crassus's camp expecting reprimand. They got decimation, a punishment so ancient and cruel that even in 71 BC it was considered myth from darker times. Crassus revived it. He gathered the 500 soldiers who'd led the retreat and divided them into groups of 10. Picture the scene. 10 men stand in a circle, friends who've shared meals, marched together, slept side by side. In the center sits a helmet containing 10 stones, 9 white, 1 black. Each man draws. White means life. Black means death. But you're not executed by professionals. You're clubbed to death by the other 9 men in your circle, by your friends. The camp fell into terrified silence. The sound of wooden clubs striking flesh echoed through ranks. 50 men were bludgeoned into pulp by their weeping comrades. When it was over, Crassus walked among survivors and stated simply, "You should fear your general more than the enemy." It worked. Lethargy vanished. Insubordination evaporated. The Roman army marching from that camp was no longer individual soldiers. It was a single, terrified, lethal instrument. Have you ever worked under a leader who ruled through fear rather than respect? How did that affect your decisions? Remember that feeling. Spartacus, meanwhile, moved south again, likely realizing his Alpine mistake, but unable to reverse course. He headed for Italy's toe, to Rhegium port. If he couldn't march home, he'd sail. He wanted to cross the narrow strait to Sicily, a powder keg with a history of massive slave revolts. Spartacus believed that landing there could ignite the entire island, creating a new kingdom of the free. He struck a deal with Cilician pirates, Mediterranean gangsters who controlled the seas. They promised transport ships. Spartacus paid in advance, handing over vast treasures looted from Italian countryside. He waited on Rhegium's beach, scanning the horizon for sails that would carry his people to safety. Days passed, then weeks. The horizon remained empty. The pirates never appeared. They'd taken the gold and vanished. Or perhaps Crassus, Rome's richest man, simply paid them more to stay away. Either way, Spartacus was stranded sea at his back, Rome's wrath approaching from the front. And Crassus was coming. But the Roman general didn't attack. He'd learned from his predecessor's mistakes. Seeing the slaves trapped on Rhegium Peninsula, he decided to lock the door. He ordered his legions to dig, not graves, but a trench, 15 feet deep, 15 feet wide, behind which they built a stone and timber wall, fortified with watchtowers. They didn't just build a short barrier. They constructed it from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea, 37 miles of fortifications built in record time. Spartacus woke one morning to find the Italian peninsula severed. He was no longer leading an army. He was governing a prison colony. Behind him, water. In front, the wall. Inside the camp, dwindling food. Winter was coming. The trap had snapped shut. On Rhegium Peninsula, history turned into a waiting game. Inside the blockade, resources dwindled. The 70,000 rebels ate the cattle, then the pack animals, then eyed the leather shields and tree bark. Starvation doesn't scream, it weakens, sapping the will to fight, turning warriors into walking skeletons. Outside the wall, Crassus sat comfortably. His supply lines were open, his men well fed. He checked the perimeter daily. The trench 15 feet deep, the wall 12 feet high, topped with palisades. He'd engineered a situation where he didn't need to risk a single Roman life. Winter would finish the job, but Spartacus refused to die quietly. He launched probing attacks, small groups throwing themselves against fortifications, testing for weaknesses. Romans repelled them easily. Sentries mocking starving slaves from atop ramparts, believing the war was over. Then weather turned. A massive winter storm rolled in from the Tyrrhenian Sea. Snow swirled in blinding sheets. Wind howled like banshees, drowning out sound. Visibility dropped to zero. For Crassus, this was miserable weather to wait out by fire. For Spartacus, it was a gift from gods. He ordered the entire army to mobilize not a raid, but an evacuation. They approached a trench section under screaming wind cover. The ditch was a gaping maw too wide to jump, too deep to climb quickly. Spartacus had no bridge-building equipment, no engineers, so he built a bridge from refuse. Rebels carried bundles of wood, rocks, earth, dumping them into the trench. It wasn't enough. The hole was too deep. Desperation took over. They threw in dead horse carcasses. Then, prisoners. In the dark frenzy, the ditch became a grotesque soup of mud, snow, timber, and flesh. They stomped it down, packed it tight, literally paving freedom's road with suffering's debris. The first wave scrambled across this makeshift causeway, scaling the wall's other side. Roman sentries, blinded by snow and deafened by wind, realized too late that shadows moving in darkness were armed men. The alarm went up, trumpets blared, but the sound was snatched away by gales. Chaos erupted along the line, hand-to-hand combat in a blizzard, legionaries stabbing at shapes, gladiators slipping on icy ramparts, dragging Romans down into freezing mud. By the time Crassus mobilized his main force, the breach was open. The dam had burst. Tens of thousands of rebels poured through, streaming back into Italian countryside like a flood. But the cost was staggering. When sun rose over blood-stained snow, the escape's magnitude became clear. Spartacus had broken out, yes, but he'd left nearly 12,000 dead. The trench was filled with bodies. The snow was red. Crassus stood on the wall, looking at footprints leading north into Lucania, furious. He'd had them, had the war in his palm, and it slipped through like water. Panic set in. If Spartacus reached Rome now, the Senate would never forgive him. His investment would be worthless, his reputation in tatters. In fear, Crassus made a political blunder. He wrote to the Senate, telling them the situation was critical, asking them to recall Pompey from Spain and Lucullus from Thrace to help trap the rebels. As soon as the letter left his hand, Crassus regretted it. By inviting Pompey, he was inviting his greatest rival to steal his glory. Pompey was Rome's darling, the teenage butcher, the man who always swooped in last minute to claim victory. If Pompey arrived before Crassus killed Spartacus, Pompey would get the triumph, and Crassus would be a footnote. Suddenly, the motivation changed. Crassus wasn't just fighting to save Rome, he was fighting against the clock. The war of attrition was over. The race had begun, and Spartacus's own army was about to betray him one final, fatal time. You'd think they'd learned. You'd think Crixus's ghost, slaughtered at Mount Garganus, would haunt every council meeting. But memory is short, and greed eternal. Having escaped Rhegium's frozen hell, the rebel army marched into Lucania's hills, battered, starving, exhausted, but free. Spartacus wanted to keep moving, find defensible positions or coastal routes where they might seize ships. But the coalition fractured again. Two leaders, Castus and Gannicus, decided they were tired of running. They commanded significant forces of Gauls and Germans who believed the Rhegium escape proved their invincibility, not desperate luck. They looked at rich Italian countryside and saw loot. They separated from Spartacus, taking 12,000 men to camp by a Lucanian lake. It was staggering stupidity. Crassus was no longer the cautious investor waiting behind walls. He was a predator racing against time. His scouts spotted the isolated camp. He didn't hesitate. Crassus hit them with overwhelming force. It wasn't battle. It was execution. The legions descended on unsuspecting rebels, pinning them against water. When Spartacus heard the battle noise and rushed back to save them, he found only carnage. The field was carpeted with bodies. Roman historians recorded a chilling statistic. Of 12,300 rebels killed, only 2 were found with back wounds. Everyone else died facing the enemy. They were brave, undoubtedly, but they were dead. Spartacus extracted few survivors, but the damage was done. His army was shrinking, morale shattering. And now the map itself closed in. Scouts brought word from the coast. Ships spotted, but not pirate vessels, Roman triremes. Pompey the Great had landed, fresh from Spanish victories, marching south to intercept. From the east, another threat emerged. Proconsul Marcus Terentius Lucullus landed at Brundisium with his legions from Thrace. The net was complete. Crassus behind them, Pompey ahead, Lucullus flanking. Spartacus retreated into Petelia Mountains, hoping to wage guerrilla war, to bleed Romans in rough terrain. But even here, he lost control. His own men turned on him, not to kill, but to disobey. The rebels were tired of retreating, tired of snow and hunger and running. When Crassus's vanguard nipped at their heels, the slaves stopped. They refused to march further, drew swords, and demanded to be led back down the mountain to face Crassus on open plains. They wanted a final stand, wanted it to end one way or another. Spartacus looked at his army and saw madness in their eyes, the fatalism of men who knew they were doomed. He knew fighting Crassus in the open was suicide, but he also knew he was no longer their general, just a man riding a tiger who couldn't get off. He agreed. He ordered the army to turn around. They marched down to the Salirus River headwaters. Crassus was waiting. He saw the slaves deploying for battle and breathed relief. He didn't have to chase them anymore. Didn't have to worry about Pompey stealing his triumph. The prey had walked willingly into the slaughterhouse. Spartacus prepared for the end, knowing this wasn't a battle for victory but for a good death. The end began not with trumpet blasts but with a blade slicing through a horse's neck. Plutarch and Appian both recorded this detail, specific enough to ring with truth's clarity. The armies were arrayed across plains near the Salirus River. The sun was high. Dust was rising. Spartacus stood before his men. His horse was brought, a magnificent beast, perhaps captured from Roman officers. The men expected him to mount, to ride above them as generals should. Instead, Spartacus drew his sword and thrust the blade into the animal's chest. The horse collapsed, blood soaking dry earth. Spartacus wiped his blade and turned to shocked troops, speaking loud enough for front ranks to hear. "If we win, I shall have many horses of the enemy. If we lose, I shall have no need of this one." It was the ultimate bridge burning. He was telling them there was no retreat, no riding away. He would fight on foot, shoulder to shoulder with the lowest slave in the line. The signal was given. The roar of 70,000 throats shook the air. The final battle of the Third Servile War began. If you were Spartacus in that moment, knowing death was certain, what message would you send with your final act? What would you want remembered? Hold that question. It wasn't a contest of maneuvers, no clever flanks, no faint retreats. This was a brawl, pure and desperate. The slaves crashed into the Roman shield wall with the force of a collapsing building, fighting with manic energy of the doomed. They threw themselves onto Roman scuta, trying to drag shields down so comrades could stab legionaries behind them. But Spartacus had a different objective. He wasn't trying to break the Roman line, he was trying to cut through it. He spotted Marcus Licinius Crassus on horseback, surrounded by elite guards, watching the slaughter from safe distance. Spartacus knew the slave army couldn't win a war of attrition. The only chance, the slim, impossible chance, was cutting off the snake's head. If Crassus died, the legions might panic. Spartacus ignored soldiers attacking him. He charged straight for the general. Historical accounts describe a man possessed, a missile of flesh and iron. He hacked his way through the melee, taking wounds and ignoring them. He killed 2 Roman centurions, veteran officers, blocking his path, cut them down and kept moving. He got close. So close he could probably see terror in Crassus's eyes, see the gold on the general's armor. But Roman numbers were simply too great. As Spartacus pushed forward, sheer weight of bodies slowed him down. Legionaries swarmed him. He was cut off from his men. A spear drove into his thigh. He fell, but didn't stop. Even on one knee, bleeding out, holding his shield against a rain of blows, Spartacus continued fighting. He killed anyone within reach of his sword. Finally, the dam broke. Roman blades descended. The Thracian was hacked to pieces, disappearing under a mound of dead Romans. With their leader gone, the rebellion's spirit snapped. The slave army disintegrated into a rout. The legions moved forward, grinding survivors into dust. The Salirus River ran red, choked with bodies of men who dared dream of home. When dust settled, silence was deafening. Carnage was absolute. Crassus rode through the field looking for his enemy's body. He wanted the trophy, wanted to drag Spartacus's corpse through Roman streets, but he never found him. Thousands of bodies were turned over, tens of thousands of faces checked, Spartacus was gone, chopped so finely, or buried so deep under piles of slain, that he returned to earth anonymously. This missing body became his final victory. By denying Rome his corpse, he denied them the closure they craved. He became a ghost, a legend, but for survivors, there was no legend, only the chain. Crassus captured 6,000 prisoners, looking at them huddled and bleeding. A lesser man might have sold them back into slavery to recoup expenses. Crassus was a businessman after all. But today, he wasn't interested in profit. He was interested in a statement. He wanted to ensure no slave ever dared look a Roman in the eye again. He ordered timber, brought miles and miles of timber. He pointed to the road leading from Capua, where the revolt began, all the way to Rome's gates, the Appian Way. He told his engineers to prepare 6,000 crosses. The battle was over, but the horror had only begun. Victory usually brings mercy, or at least quick execution for the defeated. But Marcus Licinius Crassus wasn't interested in mercy. He was interested in dividends. He'd spent a fortune raising this army and intended to extract value from his prisoners. The value he sought wasn't gold, but fear. He took 6,000 survivors, men who'd watched Spartacus die, who were already wounded and broken, and marched them to the Appian Way, the queen of roads connecting Rome to the south. Crassus decided to turn this public highway into a monument of agony. Starting from Capua, where the revolt began in that grease-stained kitchen 2 years ago, and stretching all the way to Rome's gates, the engineers worked. Every 100 feet, a hole dug, a cross raised, a man nailed to it. Crucifixion is sadistic engineering's masterpiece, designed not to kill, but to keep you alive as long as possible in maximum pain. The victim doesn't die from the nails. He dies from slow suffocation. To breathe, he must pull himself up on pierced wrists or push up on impaled feet. Every breath is a choice to endure torture. Now multiply that individual agony by 6,000. For 125 miles, the road was lined with dying men. It became a forest of crosses. Travelers heading to Rome had to walk through a gauntlet of screams, pleas, and eventually, the silence of the dead. The smell of rotting flesh became so thick it reportedly clung to clothes for days. Scavengers, crows, vultures, stray dogs feasted for months. Crassus left the bodies up, forbidding anyone to take them down for burial. He wanted the message clear. Every slave walking that road, carrying their master's luggage, looked up and saw exactly what the price of freedom was. But as Crassus rode back to Rome, expecting to be hailed as the Republic's savior, he received a bitter surprise. While Crassus did the heavy lifting in the south, Pompey the Great had finally returned from Spain. As he marched his legions through northern Italy, he stumbled upon 5,000 fugitives from the slave army trying to flee north. Pompey's troops slaughtered them easily, a mop-up operation, a skirmish compared to the war Crassus had fought. But Pompey was a public relations genius. He immediately wrote to the Senate, delivering one of history's most passive-aggressive lines. Crassus conquered the gladiators in open battle, but I have plucked up the war by the roots. The Senate, who'd always loved Golden Boy Pompey more than the darker moneylender Crassus, ate it up. They voted Pompey a triumph, the highest honor a general could receive, a magnificent parade through the city. And Crassus, the man who'd built the wall, decimated his own troops, lined the Appian Way with crosses, he was given an ovation, a minor celebration. He wasn't allowed to ride a chariot. He had to walk. He wasn't crowned with laurel, he got a wreath of myrtle. Crassus was humiliated, standing in Pompey's shadow, his heart burning with cold, jealous rage. This resentment didn't end there. It festered, driving Crassus to manipulate, bribe, and eventually form an alliance with Pompey and a young upstart named Julius Caesar to seize state control. In strange irony, defeating Spartacus didn't save the Roman Republic, it accelerated its destruction. The two warlords created by this slave war became the very men who would tear the Republic apart. Spartacus failed to destroy Rome from outside, but he forced Rome to create the monsters that would destroy it from within. What's the cost of victory when the price is your own destruction? That question would haunt Rome for the next 40 years. The Spartacus slave revolt was suppressed in 71 BC, but the tremors it caused eventually brought the entire Roman edifice crashing down. Rome thought it had solved the problem. Bodies rotted on the Appian Way. Slaves returned to fields. Wine flowed again in rich villas. But the fear remained. Spartacus's ghost lingered in every shadow, in every silent glance of a servant pouring wine. To ensure this never happened again, Rome changed. It became harder, more paranoid. The Republic, designed to prevent any one man from having too much power, started handing absolute authority to generals who promised safety. Crassus and Pompey, the two rivals forged in this war's fire, refused to disband their armies. They used military leverage to bully the Senate. Along with Julius Caesar, they formed the First Triumvirate, a dictatorship in all but name. The road from the Salirus River led directly to the Rubicon. By crushing a revolt for freedom, Rome inadvertently set itself on a path to tyranny. And what of Marcus Licinius Crassus? History has a strange sense of justice. The man who crucified 6,000 people to prove his dominance never got over his jealousy of Pompey's triumph. Decades later, desperate for military glory to match his rival, Crassus invaded the Parthian Empire in the east. He failed spectacularly. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, his army was annihilated. Legend says the Parthians, knowing his legendary greed, poured molten gold down his throat after he died. The head of Rome's richest man ended up as a prop in a barbarian stage play. The man who sought to own the world ended up owning nothing but a shallow grave in the desert. But Spartacus? The Romans tried to erase him. They didn't build statues. They wrote about him as a villain, a bandit, a monster, but they couldn't kill the idea. Throughout history, his name has been whispered by the oppressed. Toussaint Louverture was called the Black Spartacus during the Haitian Revolution. Karl Marx called him the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history. In the 20th century, during the Red Scare, Hollywood broke its own blacklist to make a movie where Kirk Douglas stood up and shouted, "I am Spartacus." He ceased to be a Thracian gladiator. He became a universal symbol of resistance, representing the terrifying, beautiful truth that even against the mightiest empire in history, against the wall, against the cross, the human desire for dignity cannot be extinguished. Spartacus lost. His army was butchered. His revolution failed. But walk down the Appian Way today, the crosses are gone. The empire is gone. Crassus is dust. But we're still talking about the slave who dared to dream of freedom. His missing body became his eternal monument. By disappearing into the earth at Salirus, by denying Rome the satisfaction of parading his corpse, Spartacus ensured he could never truly be killed. He became an idea, and ideas are harder to crucify than flesh. The real lesson of Spartacus isn't about winning or losing battles. It's about what happens when people decide that dying free is better than living in chains. Rome spent 2 years and countless legions trying to crush that decision. They eventually succeeded in killing the man, but the decision itself, that survived, passed down through centuries, inspiring every slave revolt, every labor movement, every person who ever looked at power and said no. Was Spartacus a hero who fought for freedom, or just a warlord who wanted a piece of the pie? History doesn't give us simple answers about men who operate at the extremes of human capability, but one thing is undeniable. He forced Rome to reveal its true face, the massive violence required to maintain control. The existential terror that comes from realizing your entire civilization rests on the consent of people you've brutalized. If you've made it this far into the blood and snow with me, please subscribe to Maproom Battles and turn on notifications. These forgotten stories of resistance and tragedy need to be remembered. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Was Spartacus a freedom fighter or an opportunist? Could they have actually won if they'd crossed the Alps when they had the chance? I'll be down there reading every response. Thanks for walking the Appian Way with me. I'll see you in the next battle.